Hi, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk Risk. I'm your host, Naveen Agarwal. Here we explore how leaders in medtech navigate uncertainty, make better risk-based decisions, and build safe and effective products to support sustainable growth. Today, I'm super excited to welcome my guest, Kerry. She is the Senior Manager of Global Quality at Geringa, responsible for their corporate-wide health hazard evaluation or HHE process. Now, before we get started, I just want to share with you a couple of quick disclaimers. Nothing that we say today should be treated as regulatory advice. And everything that we are going to talk about are our own personal and professional opinions, do not reflect the opinions of our organizations. With that, I want to welcome all of you today. Guys, health hazard evaluation, HHE, if you're not doing it, if you're not aware of it, know that it is a wonderful decision-making tool to facilitate and document your risk-based decisions. And we know with QMSR, this is going to be a big issue, right? So Kerry is an expert in HHE. She just gave a talk at a conference in Boston last month on this topic. She has a lot of experience, and I'm so excited to talk about HHE with Kerry. With that, Kerry, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm really well, Naveen. Thanks for the warm welcome. I'm excited to be here.
You're so welcome, Kerry. First, let's start by defining the terms because many people may not be familiar with them. What is an HHE and why is it important?
Sure, no problem. Let's get right into it. So an HHE stands for Health Hazard Evaluation, and in the medical device industry, it's a structured risk-based assessment, and it's performed when there is a known or potential product issue in the market. And its purpose is to really determine whether that issue that you've identified poses a safety risk to patients, users, or others. And if so, whether a correction or removal may be warranted. And they demonstrate to regulators that the company has a systematic process for evaluating potential safety issues in the post-market space, and that any decisions taken regarding action are then proportionate to the risk.
Yeah, that is a fantastic summary. So it's a very important and critical decision-making tool. And I have a feeling that, under QMSR, if you are ever inspected by FDA, and if they question your risk-based decision-making, a documented HHE for the issues you have handled and made decisions about would be pretty useful, right?
Absolutely. And QMSR compliance is not going to be determined by whether you have these procedures. It's going to be determined by whether you can prove risk-based decisions were made consistently and intentionally across the entire QMS. And for many years, I understand that CAPA was one of the most common and heavily scrutinized FDA inspection findings because it was a dedicated subsystem within the QSIT inspection model. But with the transition to QMSR, we're seeing the FDA place much greater emphasis on risk management as an enterprise-wide discipline. And so that's to say you need to be able to prove that risk-based decisions were made, and that includes those within HHE.
Yeah. So now, just to be clear, they're not saying that you must do an HHE. That is not the regulatory requirement. The requirement is to demonstrate risk-based thinking, and how you do it is up to you. So, Kerry, let's start by sharing with people if there's any guidance from FDA about this.
Sure. So on the FDA website, you can find information and guidance related to HHE, but there's a nuance here. HHE for the FDA, it's a tool that the FDA uses to classify a voluntary recall by a firm. And so the tool that's posted is the FDA's tool to do just that. And if you look, they actually post a Word document that is their template for doing such classification of a recall. And if you look at that Word document, there's a section in there for the firm's conclusion about health risk. And they explicitly say, attach a copy of the firm's HHE or HHA. And it's important to note here, Naveen, you may have picked it up, HHE, HHA. There is no statutory requirement to perform an HHE, call it an HHE, or do it in any specific way as we as the industry have come to know. You must demonstrate that you've made a risk-based conclusion about health risk. HHE is the way that we as a firm accomplish that, and you can use the FDA's guidance about what they're looking at to tailor your HHE form to your firm's specific needs.
Yeah, so Kerry, honestly, my head is already spinning. There are so many terms, HHE, HHA, HRA I've heard. So the bottom line is this. There is no mandatory requirement or terminology that you have to use. These are terms commonly used in the industry. It doesn't matter what you call it, but make sure that it is a very structured, documented process for making risk-based decisions. I think that is the message we want to give people, correct?
Absolutely. And when we think about how do organizations approach risk in a structured risk-based way? Well, guess what? There's a standard for that, and it's the ISO 14971 standard. And so what I find as a best practice is if you're unsure of where to start, take a look at that form on the FDA's website of what they're looking for, but also consider ISO 14971 as the framework for your HHE process, because ultimately you as a manufacturer want to be able to say with confidence, we performed a risk-based evaluation and we made a risk-based decision. And to do that, it's really important to use a framework that's rooted in defensible rigor.
That's right. That's right. Guys, if you're just joining, let me welcome all of you. My guest today is Kerry Flecknoe, and we are talking about the health hazard evaluation or the HHE process. So, Kerry, you bring up a good point about 14971. Most people in our industry now, I think, are familiar with that. They have a structured risk management process conforming to ISO 14971. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how this HHE process might fit into the overall risk management process. Can you share some thoughts on that?
Sure. So obviously we know that ISO 14971 defines the risk management process across the product lifecycle. HHE, if you think about it, is just a very specific post-market application of those same principles, right? At a very high level, identify the hazard, estimate risk, evaluate acceptability, and control it if needed, right? And so if you think about what are the elements of the standard itself, you can map those to, these are the core elements that I think should be in my HHE process. What is the problem description? That maps to like, what are identifying the hazards? Then identify the hazardous situations that are born out of those hazards in the sequence of events, right? That's part of the standard. Characterizing those harms, estimating the risk, evaluating the risk. And then the standard talks about risk control options, and that's where we make decisions on action. Decisions on action of what to do with product in the market when we have a quality issue is in itself a risk control measure. And of course, we have to think about risks that could arise from that risk control measure itself, right? We have to think about, does the risk control measure introduce any product shortages? Are there alternative therapies if we're considering a removal retrieval? We need to make sure any recall strategy is aligned with patient safety and public health.
I think you made such an important point. I want to spend a little bit of time on that, is this whole notion of the action we take in the marketplace itself being a risk control measure, but it's balanced against the benefits of the intended use. And you mentioned the shortage point. And this is COVID time. We have lived through that. There were many shortages during the COVID time. And yeah, someone on paper could say, why didn't you remove this product? But there is a maybe responsible way of using that potentially troublesome product with some more care and more instructions. So I don't want people to think that the outcome of HHE is always necessarily a correction or removal. It could be a combination of the two. It could be working with the FDA to figure out what is the right approach. Am I thinking about it correctly, Kerry?
You absolutely are, because I think it's important to remember that physical market removal may entail disruption to clinical practice, as you mentioned, create product shortages, circumstances where there's no alternative product available. So this is where additional benefit risk analyses are appropriate to make sure that any strategy is for the best interest of patient safety.
Wonderful. Okay, let's dig into a little more detail here about the practice of doing this. In your experience, where have you felt people struggle the most when they have to do this analysis? And I'll give you a classic case, and we don't have to go into details of that. If you have unknown adverse events reported from the field, I feel like that analysis is a little bit less difficult than a potentially internal non-conformance that could have an implication. Let's take these two scenarios apart. And I would like to start with the internal non-conformance first as a signal to the HHE process or a trigger to the HHE process. Where have you seen people struggle?
So I have seen people struggle, and this I think builds into the larger issue of P1 and probability, and what is the likelihood that we will see this manifest in the field and have some downstream effects on health. We know that the standard does not require the decomposition of P into P1 and P2, but it is very useful in HHE to fully understand the risks arising from unique scenarios, particularly when we find something internally, but harm has not yet occurred in the field, or we have no signals that harm has occurred. In my opinion, the consideration of P1 and P2 both, they're key elements of the standard, but the standard does not provide much guidance on how to work with those terms, right? We certainly know that in assigning P1, we want to make sure we have individuals in our organization familiar with design, construction, use, servicing, an adequate understanding of the use environment, all of this for the device. But then we need to make sure we're focusing on the best quality data that we have available. And that may not always be complaints. We may not get signals from the field. So we have to look at other post-production data that we have. Maybe we have service records for stuff that's in the field, but maybe we don't. And we found this through internal testing, bench testing, production inspection, scrap, non-conformance. We need to take into consideration what can we do with product that's in our control to get a better picture, a high quality, sort of good understanding of what's happening. And maybe that means we take lots of devices that still remain in our control and we look at them and we test them, we inspect them, and we also consider maybe that's the best quality data that we have. I think about things like sterility, okay? I don't think a user, unless there's a gross defect to the packaging, a user would likely not be able to identify that a product is not sterile. It's undetectable, right? Yeah. Similarly, consider underreporting. What happens when a defect that's usually just an inconvenience and somebody doesn't want to go through the complaint process, but it does have a potential to create a severe harm in certain situations. And so when we don't have a reasonable, first of all, you can get a reasonable understanding of the data, usually through further bench testing and internal testing. But there are times, Naveen, when you don't have any data to go by, when there's an absence of a reasonable understanding of the relative quality of the data available, or when there's insufficient information. And that's when conservative estimates of the probability of occurrence can be used to give some indication of risk. And this is where I think we get into the weeds, but we struggle. This is where statistical analysis comes in. Now, I'd love to give my opinion on this. I'm not an expert in statistics by any means, but there are some very, very simple statistical models out there that can be good estimates when data is poor, when we don't have signals from the field, when we don't have internal test data because maybe we don't have anything in-house to test and we can't get that data. But we know that just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean that it cannot or will not, right?
That's right.
And so there's some great statistical models out there. One of such is the rule of 3, which I really like. And it's a simple formula that gives the upper limit of the 95% confidence interval of the probability of such an event, one that has not occurred yet, but could. And in plain language, it basically says if none of X number of devices exhibited the behavior in which we're concerned, we can be 95% confident that the chance of that event is at most 3 in.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say, Kerry, is that yes, it is challenging. Yes, we may not have information. We may have to do some statistical analysis and modeling and have some estimates. But at the end of the day, we have to make a judgment. And that judgment involves probably looking at the situation from different perspectives, have a cross-functional review. And even the standard tells us that when the probability cannot be estimated with confidence, make the judgment based on potential severity alone. So we have guidance that we can use. I think that the point here is let's not get hung up on what we don't have.
Yes.
Let's figure out what we know to the best of our ability and make a judgment call whether it poses an unacceptable risk to the patient or not. So we'll get into a little bit more detailed discussion. But guys, again, welcome to all of you. I would love for you to participate. Please share your thoughts, questions, comments, opinions in the chat. What do you think about the HHE process? Are you familiar with it? What challenges you have come across and what best practices you can share with the rest of our community? Please be open. This is a very open sharing platform. And I will bring your questions and comments to our live discussion with Kerry to the extent possible. So I invite you to participate. Okay, Kerry, so let's keep going. I think that another thing I had in mind for you is in terms of just the mechanics of how does it work in practice? Let's say you have a signal or a trigger. Let's take the scenario of a field event, like a complaint comes in, medical safety people say, yeah, it's reportable, it's serious enough. Now you have the ball in motion. Tell us how it unrolls. What happens? What kind of meetings take place? Who gets involved? What gets challenging for decisions?
I think really the mechanics should be up to the individual legal manufacturer entity. I don't think it's wise for me in corporate to prescribe how you involve your stakeholders, but the best practice is involve those cross-functional stakeholders early and often. So we should at minimum make sure that quality, medical, regulatory, if you have legal as a resource, the top management, these individuals should be at minimum informed of the issue that you have met the threshold of whatever your triggering event is, and you will be initiating an HHE. I think it's great to have that working document in a shared repository so those individuals can look, can see, can do a sniff test of, I think we're going in the wrong direction. I think we need to document this. This is an important detail to include, and make sure everybody has line of sight to what's going on. And then we have, once really it's the quality R&D, those groups that are going to be responsible for defining what is the issue here. Are there any risk mitigations? Are there any design factors that may mitigate risk? And then we hand it over to medical. And it's very important that medical is independent player, doer in this, and they are free to use their medical judgment to perform the medical assessment. But what's important here is that we are always linking back to our risk management file. So medical, although they are independent and making their independent medical judgments based on their experience, we still want to make sure that the RMF is consulted and there's a connection to the risk file so that we are ensuring consistency between severity ratings, right? Employing a systematic way of characterizing severity levels or probability levels. All of that is contained in your RMF. In your risk management plan, really. So the connection to the risk file throughout the life cycle is important. And then once the assessment from medical is made, we're comparing it back to what the firm has decided is acceptable risk and the risk acceptability criteria for that particular product. So these should be product specific, right? And then we want to do another look back to the RMF, because remember, the original risk analysis is performed under assumptions. Intended use, foreseeable misuse, expected failures. But HHEs provide real post-market evidence about how your device is truly behaving in the field. Actual incidents may reveal failure modes not previously identified, user interactions and environmental conditions can differ from our assumptions. So updating the RMF at the end of the HHE process makes sure that the RMF is not just a one-time activity during development, but that our post-market data is feeding back into our risk management files. Controls are reassessed based on post-market performance, benefit risk decisions are documented, and this keeps the RMF in sync with actual device performance.
Yeah, Kerry, what a wonderful map you have created for us. I want to make sure that I emphasize a couple of key points for our audience today. What you are telling us is that, hey, it is a cross-functional effort. Involve relevant functions early, have a conversation going, share documents, but most importantly, everything has to be within the context of your risk management file. And on this one, Kerry, I will share with you without naming names. FDA has cited warning letters where they found that the severity table and descriptions in the HHE procedure were different from the severity and descriptions in the risk management procedure. So guys, make sure that you have alignment, consistency across the board. And your last point is even more important. Make sure that your risk management file is updated after the HHE analysis as needed. Because if it is static, guess what? Next time you will not have the appropriate severity and probability numbers. So I think this is an excellent point that you have made, Kerry. But again, guys, welcome. Please continue to share your thoughts and questions and comments once again. So, Kerry, building on this, now, final point I have is, how do people even start to learn about this? Big companies, I'm sure they have established procedures. But if you are a small company and you don't have a lot of resources, you're one quality person maybe working somewhere and trying to make this happen, what would be your advice to small to mid-sized companies to put a process together, which is lean and simple and helps with the decision making?
My advice would be, if you have product on the market, having a process and a template for making these risk-based decisions to demonstrate, hey, we didn't dismiss issues, we looked at them objectively, systematically, made risk-based decisions. You'll want a process. We call it HHE, but to your point earlier, Naveen, your organization can call it what it wants, HRA, HHA. But ultimately, you as a organization needs to use your own judgment about what, for you, would be sufficient to trigger an HHE. Typically, this is triggers like events that are either unanticipated, events that are more serious than anticipated, occurring at a higher frequency than anticipated, information from internal testing suggesting an unexpected problem affecting distributed product, regulatory non-compliances when you recognize there's a regulatory need. So listing those triggers out, being very clear about what they are, having a process for ensuring you are escalating issues that meet those triggers appropriately and timely, and then ensuring that you have the cross-functional team in place to be able to do this. And then lastly, baking your decision into the end of that process. For me, including a clear documented decision at the end of your HHE for or against field action is critical. It's the evidence trail that your organization didn't make an arbitrary or reactionary decision, but you followed a structured risk-based process. And when regulators review all of this, they want to see how your decision was reached, not just the decision itself. And a well-reasoned no decision is as powerful as a yes decision. It proves that you identified the risk, analyzed it objectively, found it to be within acceptable limits under ISO 14971 principles, and how you've documented what is acceptable for your product and your firm.
Yeah. So just to clarify your point that, hey, deciding not to take field action is with a good rationale is perfectly fine. You don't have to take field action, right? So Kerry, we have a question here, which I think is an excellent question. Who exactly does this evaluation if medical device is manufactured at a third party? If device is manufactured and distributed from a location at the external site, are they responsible for, or manufacturer who designs and develops the device? Who actually is responsible for doing this HHE? I think it's a great question.
Yes, it is a great question. And so typically the legal manufacturer should be responsible. But if you are a distributor, you may come to recognize that legal manufacturer is not willing or able to take the steps that are necessary. I think it's a good practice to have something in your HHE that says when your firm is acting as a distributor, you can still employ this process, even not as the legal manufacturer, if the legal manufacturer is unwilling or unable to perform the risk analysis and take those.
So that's an interesting point you make. And I concur with you. It's not always a legal or a regulatory consideration, but also business risk consideration from a distributor point of view, that if a defective product continues to remain in the field, they may be held liable even though they are not the legal manufacturer. So we are not going to go into the legal minutia here. But the point here is that even if you are just a legal distributor, you have to be sensitive that the product you are shipping in the market can potentially harm patients. And because of that, you could use a tool like HHE. It's not mandated for you. Am I understanding this correctly?
You absolutely are. And I think that's the good point. When your company is acting as a distributor of third-party products, perhaps the defect is actually related to your firm's activities, storage or handling, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's marketing claims for compatibility with that third-party product items that include combined use with one of your products. Or perhaps, in fact, that legal manufacturer is not willing or able to carry out a recall. And you can and should apply the HHE process, because all of these decisions should be made in the interest of patient safety and public health.
You know, now that you tell me, Kerry, I do remember seeing several warning letters and even, not necessarily warning letters, but safety advisory notices from the FDA that involved these convenience kits or combination kits that are assembled and distributed by distributors. So I think this discussion is very relevant. If your company is playing that role, be aware that this might be a tool you can use to document your risk-based decisions. So, Kerry, I think we have such a great conversation already. We are coming to a close, but there's one question I always ask from someone who has so much experience. What advice would you give from a career development point of view to early stage quality regulatory engineering professionals who are entering this field from a risk management point of view? What should they be learning about? How they should be practicing it, even though it may not be in their job description? So how can they use this type of a knowledge to advance their careers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Naveen. I think challenging yourself to step outside of what your expertise or role is within the QMS, the quality organization, is really key, because these processes do not operate in silos, right? The HHE process is the very first step of correction or removal decision. And being able to get yourself involved with, okay, now the decision has been made. What are the mechanics that go through reportability and how we inform our customers and how the recall is actually, from an operational perspective, performed? And then even before the HHE process, the quality hold, the non-conformance, all these processes work together. And so just exposing yourself and being thirsty for knowledge in those other areas it will really help your perspective.
Wonderful. So that will broaden your perspective and actually help you to play a more leadership role in your current assignment. Kerry, wonderful conversation. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just process your thoughts and share some key takeaway points in the end. During this time, guys, I want to share with you a couple of announcements. Very exciting to announce that our next session will actually be with a legal professional who works with the FDA very, very closely. And we might have an opportunity to ask some questions and understand the legal perspective on these topics. So the announcement will go out very soon on LinkedIn. Please keep an eye on it. If you are not following the Let's Talk Risk page on LinkedIn, please do that, because that is where we post our event announcements. The second announcement is about the LTR risk coach. Today, we talked about HHE process that involves a lot of judgment, right? Data may not be available. Situation may be complex, very urgent. How do you learn to make these judgments? How do you challenge your assumptions? How do you explore options? This is where the LTR risk coach can help you, which is an AI-based tool I had developed utilizing the underlying ChatGPT platform, but it works only on my knowledge sources. It's a kind of a closed loop system. It doesn't go out to the internet to respond to your questions, and it doesn't give you yes, no answers. It's actually a coach. It helps you to navigate the decision-making process. It's available to people on a limited launch basis. So if you're interested, please reach out to me and I will share that information with you. Kerry, with that, the floor is yours. Please share 2 or 3 key takeaways with us.
First takeaway, the risk landscape is evolving. You need to be able to prove that risk-based decisions are made across your entire QMS, including HHE. Using ISO 14971 as the framework for that process can enable you to do just that. Build your decision into that process. Ensure clear linkage to your RMS throughout that process. And ultimately, when done well, HHEs evolve from that procedural requirement to the strategic tool that really reflects your organization's safety.
Wonderful. These are great points to take away. Kerry, thank you so much for giving us your time and your perspective today. Guys, thank you for showing up. I appreciate your support, your involvement, engagement. This is your show. Please reach out to me anytime if you have any feedback, or if you want to participate, if you want to come to the show as a guest speaker. Trust me, no preparation required. It's not a webinar or a lecture. It is just a very simple conversation. So raise your hand, be a part of the community, and share your perspective. With that, thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend. We will see you soon.